How to see the meaning in numbers. Today we're going to look at how you can take quantitative information and find out what the story is. We're not looking at how to present the data today, we're looking at how to understand and find those messages that are in the data. So we're going to start with a little bit of a recap, then we're going to focus on reducing complexity. The single most important thing when you're looking at quantitative data is to reduce the complexity so you can actually see the message. Then we're going to look at some specific tips for how to do it and how to find a story. Then I'm going to show you an example of how I analysed the current GRIT study. So on June the 6th, the new GRIT report is going to be published. There are two sections in there that I wrote. One of those is on the use of automation platforms. So I'm going to show you how I found the story relating to the automation platforms. And then I'm going to give you my jigsaw analogy, which I hope you will like, and then the final top tips. Here's the schedule for the year. Today we're looking at how to see the meaning in the numbers. The next webinar in July is going to show you how to communicate numerical information. And there are differences in how you use visualization and representation to find data and how you use visualization and representation to communicate data. Then we're going to look at sense making with open-ended text. How do we extract the story from different sorts of open-ended text? And then finally, to sum up the year in November, we're going to think about how do we use the think, feel, do method to create presentations that change behavior. If we do a presentation and it doesn't end up changing the behavior of the audience, then to some extent that presentation is a failure. Our target is to achieve behavioral change at the end of the process. And think, feel, do is a method of making that more likely. So the recap. Last year we spent quite a lot of time, and I urge you to go back and look at them if you're not familiar with frameworks, of how to use frameworks to better find the story in the data. The most important thing to do is to define the problem properly. Most times I'm called in to help teams of client-side researchers or agency researchers. I look at what they're doing and they don't spend the time to really define the problem. And this quote comes from David Smith: "A problem fully defined is a problem half solved." It's not a quick process to define the problem properly, but it takes you halfway to the solution. You need to establish what is already known. Find out what is believed and what the expectations are. Because when you do that analysis, you want to try to validate and repudiate every one of those beliefs and expectations. Can I prove it's true? Can I show it's false? All the time we're applying these two prisms to everything that is currently believed and expected. We need to know what the organization knows. What are the known knowns? What are the known unknowns? And work with those. We need to organize the data and so that it can be analyzed, systematic checking and structural processes. And again, we've written about those in the past. Please go back and look at those videos if you want more information. Then apply a systematic analysis process using the business question as a lens. And we're going to talk a bit more about that today. And then extract and create the story. And we're going to talk about that today. So I'm going to start off with a recommendation for anybody who is interested in numbers, the complexity of numbers, and culture in particular. So this is a book that originated from France, The Number Sense. And what it tells you is that most people's sense of number is much worse than you expect. Intuitively, we actually struggle much above 3. And numbers get harder and harder as they get bigger and the tasks get more complicated. And numbers don't quite do what we think they do. So this is a really interesting book, and it also shows how sometimes those differences are cultural. They're based on the language and the way that numbers play different roles in different languages. But here's one example. What they did in this experiment was they randomly showed the number 65 and a different number between 1 and 99 on the screen. And people had to say, clicking one key or another key, which was the bigger number. Was it 65 or was it the other random number? And what they showed is that when the numbers were around 100 or they were around 30, it took just over half a second on average for people to pick them. But as the numbers got closer to 65, it takes nearly twice as long to be able to do that. So the very simple exercise, is 63 bigger than 65, is much harder than is 63 bigger than 30. Now, I'm sure intuitively you all would accept it's harder, but not necessarily how much harder. There are other experiments in the book where they show exercises with numbers between 1 and 9. They then repeat them between 1 and 99 and repeat them between 1 and 999. And you can see the errors coming in and the pauses and the delays. We're not good with 3 digits. We're not great with 2 digits. And we need to bear that in mind when we're looking for stories, because this applies to everybody. This applies to us when we are looking at data. There is an absolutely invaluable read. It was published back in 1982. I was lucky enough to see Andrew Ehrenberg do some of his presentations, and it's still a really, really useful book on data reduction. How do you make the data move into a form where you can understand the message so much better? There are 1 or 2 things that are slightly quaint and out of date. For example, he talks about the median but says it's quite difficult to calculate because before we had modern tools, the median was quite difficult to calculate. Now, of course, it's readily available in Excel and SPSS and these sorts of tools. But 99% of this book is super. Very easy to get to grips with, really straightforward examples, and it will open your eyes. And I'm going to use some of the techniques that he talks about in my presentation today. The other concept is this reduction of data and why we do it. So somebody once asked, how did he know where to put the statue of David? And what he said was, I removed all of the stone that was not David. And when we come to analyze the data, we need to remove anything that is not the message. Now, often that will be spurious accuracy. That will be unnecessary detail. It will be information about other cases, information where there is no difference. All of those need removing. So what is left is the story. Now, I'm going to take you through 4 really simple techniques of making numbers more visual, working around those problems that the Number Sense book was talking about so that we can see more of the message. 2 or 3 significant digits. Significant digits is not the same as decimal places, and I'll show you what they are in a moment. Then using sorting. Sometimes you'll find textbooks talk about diagonalizing, bringing information together so it makes sense, using indices or indexes so that we can do comparisons, and using color to make the numbers jump off the page a little bit easier. So here is some data. It's really important data from 1995 to 2010 for 183 countries. It's the per capita, how much does the government spend per person in that country on health, expressed in US dollars. And you may be peering at the screen. You may simply be leaning back because those numbers are really hard to work with. We have got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in some cases 8 decimal places in those numbers. It's just really, really hard to work with. So what can we do to make that easier? Well, we can use 2 or 3 significant digits. On this data, I've chosen to show it in 3 significant digits. What I did was 2 things. Instead of showing them per dollar, which is what this chart shows, I'm showing you them per $10. So now everything is in units of $10. The next thing I did was to tell Excel not to display the decimal places. I've still got those decimal places. They're useful for accuracy, but I do not want to see them. So I simply tell Excel, don't show me the decimal places. Show me the numbers in $10 and hide the decimal places. Now the numbers become much more intuitive. If they have got 1 digit, it means there is not much money being spent. If they have 2 digits, there's a middling sort of amount of money being spent. If they have 3 digits, there's a lot of money being spent. So the length of the number is now meaningful. The leading digit, of course, is even more meaningful, but the simple length, we can compare the 1s with the 2s with the 3s visually. We can see if we go halfway down the page, around here where my cursor is moving, the United Arab Emirates, United Kingdom, United States, all with numbers in these 2s and 3s, kind of implies that maybe having united in the name of the country is important. That, of course, is a false reading, but we'll come back to those. So that's the first step, 3 significant digits. Now I want to sort the information because that first list was alphabetical. And that's great if you want to find the data for a specific country. But if you want to know anything about the comparisons, the differences, who's at the top, who's at the bottom, you want to sort the data. So what I've done in Excel is I've simply added filters. Now I can look at this and I've said, show me them in descending order of spend in 2010. I could have said in 2002 or 2003 just by a click of a button. So we've sorted them by reducing spend in 2010. Luxembourg is the top, Monaco, Norway, United States, Netherlands, Denmark, NUI. Well, that's a bit of an odd one. We'll come back to that. Austria, we can see who is at the top. We can go to the bottom of the list and we can see who is at the bottom. And we get a sense for the sorts of countries that are appearing at the bottom of the list and the sorts of countries that are appearing at the top. And it's this issue about what sorts of countries that helps us build the story within the data. Something I do quite frequently, you're going to see it again later on when I look at the automation data, is I look at the shape of the data. So what I've done here is I've simply plotted the 2010 government spend all the way along, and actually I've not even got the name of every country visible because I'm not interested in which country is which for this analysis. For this analysis, what I want to do is to look at what shape the data is. And what I can see is there's about a quarter of the countries pretty close to zero. We then have a long gradual increase until we hit some of the European countries, and then it starts to step up with the developed Western countries, and then we have a small spike right at the top. So now I know something about the shape of the data. I know what sort of differences there are within this information. Now, if I wanted to know how have things changed over time, it would still be quite difficult, but there's a really simple trick to make data easier to understand. So what I've done is I've said for every single country, I have turned their 1995 data into 100. So for the Congo Democratic Republic, they're approximately $10 per person. We call it 100. And we do that for all of the countries as we read along the line. And now we use the same ratio for all the following years. And if we read along the top line, what that tells us in 1995, Congo Democratic Republic was worth 100. By 2003, that was 600. That's a 500% increase because the number is 600% bigger of the 1995. 2004, it was another 100% more. It had gone from 603 to 706. By 2010, we can see it's 26 times the figure in the first place. So all of a sudden it becomes very easy to see how the growth has happened. And now we can look down the chart and we can see that at the bottom end of the table, we have countries like Haiti that was very poor to start with, which has had very little growth. So that is obviously one particular worry. And we have this country, Nauru, again, which we'll talk about some more in a moment. And NEW at the top, which we're going to talk about. So using indexing and indexing with sorting allows us to see movement over time in a way that's really comparable and straightforward. And remember here, we're dealing with a lot of data, 183 countries. When we come to present it, we wouldn't present 183 countries, but at the time we do the data analysis, we need to have a lot of that information available, and then we will start to group it in different ways as part of our data reduction. Now, another thing I will frequently do is I will do this sort of chart when I'm just looking at the shape of the data. And this is taking that index data and saying, what has happened over the 15 years? And what we can see is we've got some countries which had very, very low funding, which afterwards, they've still got relatively low funding, but it's probably been investment or it's been peace in the case of Georgia and things going on. And we get this oddball that I mentioned before, NewMR, and we say, okay, well, there's clearly something odd about the data. And we have a quick look, and okay, the population is only 1,600. I'm going to stop worrying about NewMR. I'm going to take it out of my reference set, because actually this sort of data based on 1,600 people is going to be inherently unstable. But what this chart tells me is that there are only 5 countries where the data is outside of the range. So I'm not using this to understand the 178 countries that are in that bottom block. I'm just saying, are there outliers? Yes, these are the outliers. Do I understand what's happening there? Yes, I understand what's happening. And I can move on. And that's a really quick check for seeing what is in the data. Okay. Most people listening in today will be in the market research insight zone. They won't be talking about world health and so on. So let's look at it in terms of market research data. Here is an absolute classic set of numbers that we would get back from a brand attribute study. And we've got the percentage of people who agree that brand 1 is sexy, that brand 1 is cheap, and so on. And this is quite often how you see the data. It's in questionnaire order. Now, if there are any clients in the room, you should pretty much never see data that's in questionnaire order. You should see data that has been sorted and thought about and extracted and shown to you in a sensible configuration. But as a researcher, if you're an analyst, when you first look at the data, it is likely to be in questionnaire order. That's not helpful. And for some crazy reason that I have never understood, you will frequently see decimal places on this data, and they're really not helpful. So what can we do to make the data more friendly? Well, this data happens to be in Excel, so there is a simple 2-click thing which you can do, which says use conditional formatting. Select all the tables, select all the cells, say use conditional formatting, and it does this for me. So the bright green cells are the big numbers, the bright red cells are the small numbers, and the numbers that aren't bright are in between. So very quickly I can see that stylish for brand 7 is a very small number. That's that bright red one in the middle. And we can see that there are a few bright green numbers in the table. So that's fine, but it's still not intuitive. So let's make it 2 significant digits. So now what we're looking at, we've taken away those 2 decimal places, we've taken away the decimal point. So now the data is much easier to see. It's the same data that we saw before, but wow, it's much quicker. We can see those bright green numbers range from 87 through to 97. We can see that the only bright red number is 2, and the next step up from that there's a 10 and 11 and 13, which are perhaps interesting. It's still a bit hard work, however, because these things are all over the place. So this is sorting the data, and I call it Diagonalise, or sorry, the people who talk about these things call it Diagonalise. It's not my word, because we use sort in 2 directions to bring the information together. The brands are now sorted, and the attributes are now sorted so that similar information is adjacent. In the top left, we have the brands that are sexy, strong, and stylish. We have the attributes that are associated with brands 4, 5, and 2. On the bottom right, we can see brand attributes that are associated with brands 1, 6, and 7, and we can see the brands that are associated with friendly and cheap. So now it starts to pull the data together, and we can start to see patterns. First of all, we would start to explain the big story. Why are 4, 5, and 2 associated with sexy, strong, and stylish? Why are brands 1, 6, and 7 associated with friendly and cheap? Would be the starting point. Then we would start to look at relevant differences. So brand 5 actually scores quite lowly on strong. We can see that beige cell standing out in the middle of all that green. So where you get one color that's different standing out, it already suggests to you, look at me, look at me. It might not be interesting, but you certainly look at it and investigate it and see if that's something that is going to be part of the whole story. And then those percentage signs, if you look there, 1/3 of the information in every cell is the same. It's a percentage sign, but your eye has to process it. Take it away, and all of a sudden it's just that little bit clearer. So you don't want percentage signs in your data. You don't want decimal points. You don't want decimal places. You want 2 significant digits or 3 significant digits. That's going to help you see those messages. You want to sort the information so that it's helping you see the messages, and you want to use things like colors and charts to bring that together. Now, you can't just process data. You actually have to be looking for the answer to a question. So to use analysis to find answers, you need questions. To use visualization to find answers, you need questions. For example, does the expenditure on health vary by wealth or politics? Just think about that for a moment. Do you think that the expenditure on health in countries varies by wealth or by politics? Do some countries spend a lot more because they're keen on being fair to everybody, and do some countries spend a lot less, which we would call that politics or philosophy? Or is it largely driven by money? Well, once we have a question, we can arrange the data. And I went to Gapminder, which is where I got that earlier data from. And if you don't know Gapminder, please look at Hans Rosling TED videos. Please visit the site. It's a fantastic tool. It will teach you a lot about visualizing data. And what I've done here is on the left-hand side is I've taken that health data, government health spending per person. And along the bottom, income per person, so wealth essentially. Income per person along the bottom. And the size of the bubbles are the size of the countries. So the really 2 big red circles in the middle are China and India. The big red green circle at the top is the United States. Then there's color coding within that. So Asia is pink. Americas are green. Europe, yellow. Africa, blue. And if we look at the data, what it says to us is actually it's mostly about wealth. That the more wealth there is in a country, the higher the income, then the higher the amount of government spending. The USA is absolutely on that line for the amount of government spending you would expect a rich country to be spending. There is 2 areas of difference that we can then pursue. So that's the main story. And what we do when we're analyzing data is we find the main story first, and then we find the relevant differences. And there are 2 interesting relevant differences. One is there are a group of countries who are rich, but who are spending a little bit less on government health. So Saudi Arabia is the larger of those circles. Some of the others are the Gulf states as well. The second exception is the blue countries on the left-hand side. We have a little bit of a hockey stick going on, because these countries here, I'm going to circle them now with my cursor, should actually have even less spending on health than they do have. There's a leveling off effect. Now, maybe that's to do with world aid, maybe it's to do with the basic minimum that's required. We'd need to investigate that. It raises a question for us to follow. But we can see that once you get below about $2,000 per person per year, the amount of expenditure doesn't fall anything like as quickly as we would expect it to. So we get a more integrated picture. We can also change that spending. So now I've looked at total health spending. Instead of looking at government spending, let's look at total health spending. And a couple of things happen here that are interesting. First is that those African countries now pretty much fall on the line. So the amount of private spending in those African countries is less, and in fact it's so much less that without the government spending they would be dipping below the line. So the government spending is really what is keeping those countries into a sensible total health picture. At the top of the chart, the United States is now moved above the line, so the total of government and private expenditure in the United States is higher than you would expect for a country of that wealth. And we can explore later on whether that leads to positive outcomes. But now we're beginning to understand that spending on health is mostly about income, and that there are interesting differences, but the differences are relatively few in number and relatively marginal in impact. So we use the business question as a lens. When we're trying to understand how to find the right answer, we have a business question. What action does the client, the end user, the stakeholder have to take once they have the results of the analysis? Because that will tell us a lot about which analysis to do and how to do it. The same data will deliver different stories based on different business questions. This is one of the reasons why industry reports and things like the GRIT report, which we're publishing on June the 6th, are so hard to write, because you don't have a single business question. You don't have a stakeholder who is asking you, hey, I need to spend more money on advertising. Where should I put that money? That's a great business question. Instead of that, we have lots of people who want to know what is the state of the industry, and they want to know different parts about the industry. Some want to know about APAC, some want to know about global, some want to know about mobile, some want to know about automation. So it's really hard when you write industry reports to have quite such focused information. Many readers with different needs and different questions. The business question defines what is in the analysis, what is out of the analysis, and where the magnification should be. So first of all, we want to find the big story, then we need to find the relevant detail. So once we've got the total story, we then start looking for things like, are there people who have a different story, different from the main story? So are there people for whom we would recommend to the business a different action? If there are some people who have statistically different views, but the business action is the same, that is not an interesting story. That is not a relevant difference. What we're looking for, people who have a different story where we would take different actions. We want to know who these people are. We want to know what their story is. Why are they different? And what are the business implications of these differences? There's a useful book I've mentioned before, so I'm going to just cover it very, very quickly. Seeing What Others Don't, from Gary Klein. And he develops what he calls the 5 C's. So this is a framework approach. There is nothing magic about his 5 C's than compared with anybody else's. If you have a system you're already using, fine. If you don't have a systematic framework for doing the analysis, then I'd recommend you read this book and consider using his 5 C's. So he's looking for connections. Often in our case, that's correlations, but it's also triangulations with other studies and other reports and other domains. Coincidences. When do we see something happening again that we've seen before? Curiosities. Now that can be a single verbatim or a single data point that we look at. So that data point for NewMR that I showed you earlier with a really high peak, that was a curiosity. I looked at it, we found out that it was only 1,600 people, so it goes in the discard pile because it's not going to take me forward. Another curiosity might be the key finding that I get from the whole study. Contradictions. Where do they disagree with your expectations or your client's expectations or the fieldwork company's expectations? And where do you need a creative jump? So if you find something that does not make sense, then you absolutely want to look at it and say, why is this not making sense? What do I have to change in order to be able to understand this? So the top 3 of these build on the current picture: the connections, the coincidences, the curiosities. Contradictions mean we have to rethink an assumption. Something we thought was true clearly isn't true. So what are the implications of that? And creative jump often means we have to discard an assumption and move in a completely different direction. So I've mentioned the GRIT report. Here's the data as it arrived to me. You're not supposed to be able to read all of this, don't worry. We've got 14 columns, so 14 different areas where people could be saying, we are using automation. So if we take the first column, project design, people could say to that, it's not applicable to our organization. We don't do project design. So we're not using automation, not because we've disregarded automation, but because we don't do project design. Then we have thinking about it, but haven't tried it yet. Then we have not sure. Then we've got people who are exploring pilot use cases, and then people who've already adopted it widely. So we've got quite a lot of interesting information there, and it's in questionnaire order at the moment. and it's got a decimal place because that's how it came out of SPSS. So this table is pretty much how I received it out of SPSS. And you're going to see the final report on June the 6th. First thing, sort and chart. So I did the things that I told you about before. I sorted it by adopted. So 29% analysis of survey data is the highest adoption. Matching contract talent to projects is the smallest adoption. So I've sorted it by that. I've reduced it to 2 significant digits, and we've used color and actually graphical as well to bring that into key. Now, sorting is an interesting issue here because I could have sorted it by the gray bar. It's not applicable to my organization, and that would have highlighted slightly different things, because one of the things we can see is that at the bottom of the table, biometric and non-conscious data, matching suppliers and buyers, matching contract talent to projects, between 1/3 and 40% of people don't do this activity. So of course they're using automation less for this activity. We could even consider whether to rebase it, and for some of the analysis we did that, excluding these people and then say of those people who do the task. We could have joined together the 2 green bars, so the 26 and 29% on the top row, and said actually let's take that as 55 and sort them all by that, because if we did that, analysis of text data would have jumped up the order. So there are things you have to try to see which one of those explains the data. But to do that, you do it by sorting it more than once. You don't do it by doing mental gymnastics in your head of trying to say, well, that actually could be as high as this, and I could move this number across. No, don't make the job hard for yourself. Use a system where it's really easy just to rekey and resort, look at that information in different ways, find out what's going on. So this was the first step. This gave us the big picture that told us that analysis of survey data and charting and sampling and survey design were the big issues. And then there is a tailing off down at the bottom end. We have some where there is much less adoption of automation. Now, normally, when you come to read the GRIT report, there is an assumption that there will be a difference between North America, Europe, and the rest of the world. And there is an assumption that there will be a difference between clients and suppliers. And this is frequently true. So the first thing that I did when I got past the big story and I started to look for the relevant detail was to have a look at these standard tabs. And you could read those numbers down. They're in the same order as they are in the total picture. So that's my ranking. But it's quite hard work. There are some differences in there. We could use color coding, but that wouldn't help a lot because it would tell us that the top of the page tends to be the big numbers and the bottom of the page tends to be the small numbers. It's not breaking out quite what I want. So I'm going to add some data. So for the 3 regions, I've added the region spread. The largest number on that row subtracted from, and the smallest number subtracted from that. So I subtract the smallest number from the largest number in each row, and then I will apply my color coding. And immediately it tells me there are no big differences. 7% would be statistically significant, but I'm really not interested in something as small as 7%. I'm not particularly interested in 9%. It's not so big that it's worth writing home about and saying this is a business decision difference. If we look at those 9s, it suggests that the rest of the world is using it slightly more for sampling, they're using it slightly more for survey design, they're using it slightly more for report writing, but it's not that big that it's interesting. So let's have a look at client and supplier, and this time there are only 2 of them, so I can simply subtract one of them from the other. And what I've done is I've subtracted the client from the supplier and applied color coding. And there are only 2 numbers on that page that I consider to be at all interesting, and only one of them very interesting. The analysis of social media data. 59% of clients who took part in the GRIT study said they're using some sort of automation platform for that. It drops to 42% for suppliers. Why that is interesting is that I already know, I'm going to make connections. Remember my 5 C's? A connection. I know from the study we did a few months ago that clients are using analysis of social media far more than suppliers and agencies. And this is another level of that. So the people who are doing more of it are using more automation. It makes sense. It builds part of this richer picture. Similarly, sampling is much more likely to be on the supplier side than the client side. In fact, maybe it's surprising that suppliers are so high. Perhaps that's all those people using Qualtrics and Question Pro, who've got in-house licenses to confirm it, who are running insight communities, and all of these sorts of things are appearing on the client side there. So I've got my big picture. But I found that there aren't really any interesting differences by region. There aren't what I would call interesting differences, or very few, between client and supplier. So I'm going to turn it around now and say, where are the differences? So for every participant, I'm going to create a variable from the 5-point scale. So there were 14 different things you could be using automation for. If you said we're using all of them in wide application, then you could score 70, 5 times 14. If you said we're not using, sorry, none of these are applicable to my organization, so maybe you're a client-side organization that only ever receives research, you don't do any analysis, no hands on yourself, no automation. So for all 14, you score them 1 because it's a 1 to 5 scale. So the minimum score is 14. And I'll do that for all 2,800 people in the database, and I get a distribution. So what we can see is there are about 60 people who said no to everything. There's about 10 people who said we're scoring everything a 5, and then we get loosely a peaked distribution. Most people are in the middle. 43, 42 is a real spike in that data, which is averaging, everybody's saying 3 times 14 is 42. So that's where the data spikes. Now I understand that there are differences. There are people who are doing lots of automation. They're on the right-hand side. There are people who are doing very little automation. They're on the left-hand side. And there are a lot of people in the middle. So what I'm going to do now is create 3 groups of people. Low, the bottom 25%. Medium, the middle 50%. High, the top 25%. So the high are people who are doing a lot of automation. Low are people who are doing hardly any automation. And the medium is everybody else. And I want a nice big group in the middle because I can see it's a spike distribution. So 50% takes that out. We're going to run the tables with low, medium, high as the headings and look for large differences. As I said before, 7% would be significant, but it wouldn't be large. We want large. So here's what I found, or part of what I found. So I've got high, medium, and low percentage. I've got the base, how many people were in that study. So 2,367 are in the total. 24% are in the high column, 25% are in the low column. Because you have to pick an integer to split them, it doesn't come out as exactly 25%, 25%. I then looked at everything that came out of the tables and said, what was the biggest number? And the biggest difference in terms of the gap between high and low was the answer to the question, your professional organization situation, survey platform provider or survey software. Amongst the survey platforms and the survey software and the platform providers, 47% are in that high automation group, and only 10% of them are in the low group. So in the total sample, 24% are in the high and 25% are in the low. The biggest difference are between the people in the software business. It's not surprising. So that is one of those findings which is a validation of your thinking, but is not a particularly interesting piece of information. Number of employees. So if the number of employees is between 501 and 1,000, you are more likely to be using automation. So we start to think, well, is it to do with bigger companies? This is a really interesting one. This is client-side researchers who expect their spending to decrease, to go down in 2017 compared with 2016. They are more likely to be using automation. They are less likely to be low users of automation. So we're starting to see a pattern there. And the next one adds that. which vertical you're in. So this is only asked of research buyers. The consumer staples, the people who don't have big product differences, who have to work on these issues like brand attachment, emotional engagement, because that's all that's left, and who are incredibly fiercely competed in terms of margins, are the people looking for automation. These are likely to be, and I don't know the identity of the individuals, but these are likely to be Procter & Gamble's, Unilever's, Campbell's, Heinz, Mondelez, these sorts of companies. And we know from other work that companies like Unilever are leading the charge into this area. So that ties together and makes connections for us. Number of employees, 1,000 or more, makes you more likely to be using automation. And interesting enough, when we ask people the question, this was to the whole sample, will sample get better or get worse over the next couple of years? People who thought sample was going to get better are more likely to be using automation. So some of that will be because they're from sample providers and platform providers. Some of it is to do with optimism. Optimists seem to be more likely from the rest of the data to be using automation. As you'll see in the full report, agencies whose revenues are increasing are more likely to use automation. Clients whose spending is decreasing, but who want to get more value, are likely to be using automation. And we start to build a story. The other half of the story is built by people who are much more likely to be low than high. And we will go through that process. So what is the story that I found? Well, that's embargoed until June the 6th. So please log in when the GRIP report comes out and read how those numbers were turned into a story. So the final thing I want to do is to give you a way of thinking which unlocks something you already know. Many of you will do jigsaws. You probably did jigsaws when you were younger, and your children do jigsaws. I certainly still do jigsaws as an adult. So what happens first of all is we tip out the box and we get all the jigsaw pieces. And we have to make sure that these are all from the right jigsaw, and we have to turn them over so they're the right way up and we can see what's on them. The basic data cleaning and processing business. So we turn them all over and we start to notice what's there. And we start to gather the straight edges, and I've put the blue at the top of the screen and I put the green at the bottom, and I've found some straight edges. This is what we're doing when we're processing the data. We're finding the edges, we're finding patterns. If you notice in this part of the screen where my cursor's moving around, I've put together some striped pieces that I spotted. I don't know what they are, but I'm going to put them together. And then we have some more patterns and structures, so we can see refreshments being made there, and it's a side piece. Great, we found a corner piece, so we know where that goes. Another piece like that with the connections, we've got the summer fate, it's going to go on the left hand side. And I use this jigsaw in workshop situations, and people are starting to talk about what they think it is. And we've got people from all over the world, and they will start to say, summer fate. Now, they may or may not know what a fate is, but if they do, they know it's something to do with a carnival or a fair, and some of the other pictures are coming in. We keep assembling a larger picture. We've got to get this total picture. And once we have the dimensions in place, we're in a much stronger place. Once we've got a frame for the framework, that is useful too. Now from the big picture, we start to find the relevant sub-stories, the subplots. So we have a table going on there. We have a tent with those striped information. We have children sitting on the floor. We're finding the subplots. We're bringing that story together. Eventually, we will have all the data connected, structured, organized, talking to us, and that is when we create the story. We've been picking up snippets of the story as we go along, but before we really know that it's children on the grass watching a Punch and Judy show, we need the full picture. But we will get parts of that picture as we go along, and then we will decide what we want to talk about when we know what the business question is. So the top tips: use a frameworks approach. Finding the information in the data is not about being an intuitive genius, unless you happen to be an intuitive genius. For the rest of us, it's about using a systematic approach, and frameworks is the way to go. A problem defined is a problem half solved. Data reduction is the key to seeing the meaning in the data. Sometimes you'll see people offering a system, we will automatically chart everything by everything for you. That is horrible. That gives you more pages than there are people in the data set sometimes. What you really want to know is, what is the interesting data? Show it to me in a way where I can see it really easily. Create derived variables, sort the data, use colors. Find the big picture first, then the relevant detail and the contradictions. So thank you very much. Please do follow me on Twitter or sign up to receive our weekly newsletter. And with that, I'd like to throw it open to Q&A. Hi, Betty.
Hi, Ray. How are you?
Excellent, thanks.
Good. And thank you very much for, once again, a really insightful webinar. So we've already got a couple of questions on the GoToWebinar platform. First one from Luis Martinez that was asked quite early on in the webinar, earlier on, who's asking, do you find this lack of using frameworks and story finding occurring in consumer insights teams?
Very much. What I see is quite a lot of people who will simply use their standard cross breaks and say, this week the data said this, and it will be a regurgitation. It will often be, they will often show all of the questions that were asked. My sort of warning signs when I see a presentation is, if they've shown me the results of every question that was asked, then that suggests they haven't really thought about what's in the data. If they've not added any combinations of questions, I'm going to be worried. And if they show me the results in questionnaire order, I'm probably not going to stay. So that is one side of the problem. The other is that sometimes when I see very highly paid consultants working with data, they fall into the trap of the first plausible story. Because they are normally incredibly pressed for time, they sort of stop when they find the first plausible story in the data, the low-hanging fruit, and we can do better than that by using frameworks.
Right, okay. And another question from Lewis that's come through, and this was earlier, this was again sort of earlier on the presentation, but halfway through, asking, could you analyze this data in a perceptual map? And the data that Lewis was referring to was the slide that you had about halfway through with the colored Excel matrix. So could you analyze that kind of data in a perceptual map?
I could. I would probably be more likely to use a correspondence map, because that would show them within the same space. It would show 3 of those brands associated with strong and so on. It would show the other brands associated. I would then, once I saw the associations, have to go back, because at the time I report it, I have to know what the numbers are. And the perceptual map doesn't give me the numbers. So I would normally use perceptual maps for problems that were harder than that. For that problem, for me, the tables, the numbers, the color coding, because I'm talking about not much more than a minute to get to that state. To get to a correspondence map and to analyze it is going to take me 5 minutes. And then I'm going to have to go back to the numbers afterwards anyway. So for me, I would use perceptual maps for more complicated tasks.
Right, okay, well, I think that concisely answers Lewis's question. Thank you, Lewis, for those. So a couple of questions from me, Ray, and this is really inspired by some of your webinars that were quite recent. So in a webinar that you did not that long ago on automation, you were talking about skills for new researchers. Do you feel, in your view, that these skills for finding the meaning in the numbers, finding the story for the insights, are these really being taught to research students and new researchers, in your view?
No, I think there is a general feeling that in the UK, in schools and universities, we're not teaching problem-solving skills sufficiently. And certainly around the world, I see, when I'm working in workshops, a deficiency in problem-solving skills. and actually a deficiency in the mechanical skills of how to use tools like Excel really efficiently. As I say, to create that table would have taken me well under a minute, including reading the information and saying, oh, yes, this is what I need to do. I need to do this, this, and this, because the Excel skills are deeply embedded.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a contradiction here, because with automation, the nature of those specific skills will change, but at any moment in time, you need to be good with whatever the current tools are. So at one stage, I was good at Lotus 123. Later on, one had to be good at Excel. As we move into AI-assisted tools, then you will need to be good at commanding those tools and at interpreting what they're telling you. So there are two levels of skills. One is in problem solving, and one of them is simply in the skills of using the tools properly.
Right, okay. Well, before I go on to the next question that's come from GoToWebinar, I've got a question about something you just said, Ray, that will either make me sound like I've lived in a cave or an ovum. Either way, what is Lotus 123?
No, it's just your youth, Betty. It was the leading spreadsheet package at one time. Okay, I'm going to talk out to some older people out there. So after VisiCalc, for those of you who can remember VisiCalc, yes, then Lotus 123 was the leading spreadsheet, and then we consolidated into Excel. There were a couple of others around as well. And when that happens, you have to make sure you get your skills back up to speed with the different system.
Right, okay. Thank you for the clarification there, Ray.
It's just your youth.
So two questions from David Vance. So the first one is, to what extent do you see a decrease in problem solving skills related to an increase in automated tools? So we're slightly moving away from sort of finding the story and the insights, but it's all related, I suppose.
As we get more automation, then I don't think there's any reduction in the need to be able to problem solve and find skills. The locus of that changes, so that the position at which you do that in the process changes. And instead of having to do some things mechanically, you would ask the system to do them, and then you would look at the outputs. So knowing the difference between something that is just, oh yeah, well, that's obvious. So when the data comes back and tells me that the people who write platforms are using automation more than the people who don't write platforms, well, that's statistically true, but it's not helpful, because actually we could have intuited that anyway. It's that step which is very human as opposed to machine oriented. But certainly things change as a consequence. And I mentioned earlier Andrew Ehrenberg's book, Data Reduction, which is absolutely great. But there is this charming section, a little paragraph in it, where he talks about the value of the median, but then says it's not practical for commercial use, because before we had spreadsheets, before we had VisiCalc and Lotus 123 and Excel, you had to rearrange the data into order, sort it, and then count through to find where 50% of them came. It was labor intensive, so we didn't use the median. Now, there is no excuse for analysts not using the median. They should be looking at it in their crosstabs. They should be looking at it in Excel, whatever package they're running. So you need to keep evaluating what you're using for problem solving and where the problem is as the tools change.
And that brings on to another question, very much a kind of human versus machine. So Ray, we have a automation series running on NewMR this year, and one you've already done a couple of those webinars where we talk about automation, potentially speeding up the research processes, faster, better, cheaper, all that sort of stuff. But actually, where you have lots of naysayers talking about market research, it's dying and everything will be taken over by automation. Actually, what you talk about today is very much a human touch. This is not something that a machine could do. And yes, we are having an artificial intelligence event later on this year, but what are your thoughts about kind of the need for that human touch in the face of lots of automation and technological innovation in our industry?
There is an enormous growing need for that human intuition, human analysis, and explaining the process, because the amount of data is growing exponentially. The tools will, at best, allow the humans to cope with that growing amount of data. They will not, in the foreseeable future, so 5 years, they will not replace the ability to know, well, that finding is just obvious. That finding is probably bogus to do with some sort of sampling error, and that is really interesting. Those sorts of things, and then knowing which analyses you want to run next, and understanding, which is what we're looking at in the next webinar, how to show that information to humans, fellow humans, in a way that results in behavior change, is quite a long way from AI and those taking a lead there.
Right, and the sweat has now been wiped off many listeners' brows. And how important do you feel it is, Ray, for researchers to not just know what the research questions are, in order to uncover the insights as you've covered in today's webinars, but also to understand what the business impact might be? So what is a organisation, a client, going to do with that data for business growth, for success in some way? Is it as important to know the business needs as well as the research questions?
It's a slightly difficult question to answer, because, I mean, if you look at the framework form that I use as the standard framework, one of the questions in there is, what actions do you plan to take once you have the answers? Because that helps me do the analysis. So in a perfect world, it would be an incredibly important thing to know. Probably more than 90% of the time, the person who has commissioned the research doesn't actually know the answer to that. And so you try to find it out and you work together with them. But in many, many cases, you have to do the research based on the information you're given, which is not going to be as full as you would like. And therefore, we can't say it's indispensable to have this, because otherwise we wouldn't tackle the projects. So you get as much information about what decisions, what actions you're going to take once you have this information. What are your unknowns? What are your red lines that you don't want to cross? And so on. You just find as much about that as you can.
Right, okay. And we've got one more question. This one is from the GoToWebinar from Roger Brooks, who is asking, does one need to create different reports / analyses for different client audiences who have different needs? For example, executives versus market researchers.
If they have different needs, then you need to do different analyses. So if you have somebody whose responsibility is global and somebody else who is emerging markets, then you are going to look at the emerging markets in much more depth for the emerging market person and pull out more information. If you have two executives who have to make different business decisions, so one of them has to launch one of these 3 products and the other one has to design the next 3 products, then yes, you would do different analysis for those. I wouldn't do different analysis for senior management and the insight team. I would have a different presentation. It would be much more truncated. It'd be much more action focused. So the analysis that underlies the material that I would present back to an insight manager and the material that presented to a senior executive would be different, but based on the same analysis. I would never do an extra analysis for the senior management that I had not done for the market researcher. That would be disingenuous and not respectful. Thank you, Betty, and thank you everyone for listening.